Makahanya haramita shingyo Genji Saiboza Gyojin Hanya haramita Jishoken Gon Gai Guro Isai Gu Yaku Shari Shiki Fui Gu Fui.
Master Sesso said, "Though descriptions can be given, what really matters cannot be rendered in words. In front of a Shinto shrine, a believer may be seen to pull the straw rope that summons the divinity, then clap his hands 3 times to indicate that he has come to worship, and then with folded hands bow deeply in the presence. All this can be described down to the last detail. The divinity cannot be seen anyway. But what happens in the heart of the sincere believer in the act of bowing, that is the blessing. And that is indescribable." This extract from Master Sesso, and Master Sesso was the first teacher of Venerable Myokyo-ni when she went to train at Daitoku-ji in 1960, and he died in the middle of the 1960s. And I think it's fair to say that she was particularly fond of him, and he made a very striking impression on her, not only for his wholeheartedness, but also because he was a very gentle man, although she was always quite clear that if he needed to become the Zen master, with all that that implies, then he was certainly very capable of that too. And she recounts actually about that wholeheartedness and that natural harmony in his in the way he comported himself, that quite early on in her training with him, when she had been accepted for sanzen or for interview practice with him, he was walking along the pavement, and she, as the student, was walking a few steps behind him, and he was talking to somebody else, and it was a very windy and blustery day, and a gate had come off the latch and was blowing open in the wind, and as he walked past it, he just stretched out and closed the gate without breaking stride at all. And there was something in the way he did that, she said, that really impressed her, about that being completely at one with the circumstances, even though he was holding this conversation with someone else at the time. So Master Sesso in this is describing what happens at a Shinto shrine, and of course Shinto is the native belief system of the Japanese, and although in the 19th century it was co-opted by the government and turned into a national religion, actually Shinto is a very old religion. It was never a state religion before that time. In fact, really, it was a collection of folk beliefs, and didn't really have any one particular sort of cohering philosophy or theology at all. In fact, there's a quote from the American mythologist Joseph Campbell, who, when on one of his visits to Japan, was at a Shinto festival, and he was talking to a Shinto priest. And he asked him, he said, what is your philosophy? What is your theology? And the Shinto priest was taken aback and thought for a moment and said, "We have no philosophy. We have no theology. We just dance." And in fact, Shinto is very much a nature-based religion. In this belief system or series of beliefs, the spirits of nature are everywhere, and they indwell everywhere. And really, there are Shinto shrines all over the place, and any place in nature that has some kind of feeling of numinosity. It may be a tree, it may be a waterfall. Perhaps the most famous one, obviously, is Mount Fuji, the great mountain. That obviously has is a centre for pilgrimage too, and anywhere that has a feeling of numinosity about it, it's believed that a spirit or kami indwells in that particular place, and so it can become a place of veneration, a place of worship, so to speak. And quite often, over time, a small temple will be erected and a shrine will be prepared, and that shrine is really just an empty box because the kami is obviously invisible. You can't see it, but it's believed that when a devotee goes, he puts his coins in the box, rings the bell, claps his hands, and that which lets the kami know that someone's come to pay respects, to venerate, and the kami is expected to manifest in the box. Of course, as Master Sesso says, the spirit cannot be seen. It's taken purely on faith, and the devotee bows, and in that bowing, Master Sesso remarks that is the real blessing, and he says that is indescribable. And really, perhaps we may be sort of thinking, well, that's all very well for Shinto. Obviously, we don't have Shinto here. If we're practicing Zen Buddhism, we don't really go in for very much for this sort of ritualistic approach. I mean, there are forms of Buddhism that are more ritualistic, but Zen surely not. But actually, if we look at it, there's a lot of ritual in Zen. Because what does ritual do? Well, ritual actually transforms a place, and we could say it even makes an ordinary place into something sacred. Whether we have a shrine at home, or perhaps we have a certain corner of a room where we have our cushion or our chair where we sit Zazen meditation, the act of creating that space and the act of performing ritual actions such as bowing to our cushion or chanting and sitting zazen as well in the formal way that we do. These are all ritual actions. And it's one of those points, I remember once it really struck me when with our classes at the Buddhist Society. We go up to the lecture room, and it has lecture room written on the door, and most of the time, or they have lectures in there, and the chairs are laid out as a sort of lecture room format with a speaker at the front and all the rest of it. But when the Zen group goes along, the room is empty. The table is, we place a Buddha Rupa on there, there's flowers, we place candles and an incense holder. The cushions are laid out in two straight lines and the chairs behind them. And then when people come up, we don't have to say anything. They take their shoes off, they're all lined up outside. People put their hands together in gasho, that's with the palms pressed together, and then step into the room, turn and bow to the altar, which is what that table has now become. And of course that lecture theatre has now been transformed. It's been transformed into a zendo, a place for sitting zazen, and that, if you like, is the temenos. That is the sacred space that has suddenly appeared because we've changed the furniture and because we behave in it in a way different to if we were walking into the same room and there was going to be a lecture there, a straightforward lecture. So it's not even, in fact, funnily enough, even with the lecture room, we might think, well, there's no ritual actions there, but there are ritual actions. I mean, not ritual actions about sacredness particularly, but there are actions that convey very clearly that the room has now become a lecture room. So in this way, we actually transform spaces and we behave differently in them. And by behaving differently, by the use of those ritual actions, by giving ourselves into those ritual actions, then suddenly the heart responds differently. And this really is the great power of ritual action, whatever its form. It's the same, obviously, again, in the Zen group, in our particular group. We dress in black and white. And this, again, adds something. There's a message there. But the interesting thing is who is that message being taken up by? Because it's certainly not the case that the people who go to the Zendo, the people who regularly sit there, are consciously thinking about all these things I'm discussing now, and I certainly don't. But we behave quite unconsciously differently in that space. And I remember once Venerable Myokyo-ni after talking about bowing and the importance of bowing, saying that when we bow, and I think at the time she was talking about the use of bowing when working with the emotional energies, the emotional power, the emotional household, because we obviously, when the fires flare up, we were always taught at the beginning, as soon as the awareness comes in of the fires flaring, we put the hands together in gasho and we bow into those fires, giving ourselves into them, as she said, and we might even say that little mantra that she used to give us: precious energy has arisen, the fires still burn, I am still here, please burn me away. And we bow into it. And she used to say that it doesn't matter what we think is happening, even if I don't really understand what that bow is about. She would say the body understands. And this is the one, really, the one who's master of the body, the one who's in the body. This is the one who is being spoken to by using ritual. It, if we like, it almost bypasses conscious mind and goes straight into those depths. And this is, of course, the wisdom of the body that naturally responds to circumstances if it's allowed to. And interestingly, with that working with the fires, of course, again, she used to say, the passions are the Buddha nature, and the Buddha nature is the passions. And of course, when we're working with those emotional fires, quite quickly or quite easily, I can make an enemy of them because they frighten me a little bit, my temper. I get frustrated and annoyed because I can't sit zazen, or because I don't get out of bed on time, and all that sort of thing, even though I've sort of set my heart to actually doing those things. And so I become frustrated, and it's easy, as we know, we talk in Zen, we talk about those emotions being personified as a great bull, if we know the bull and his herdsman, that great analogy. And people can find themselves hostile or in opposition to that bull and regard it as almost as an enemy. But we forget that bull is our own heart. The power that underpins, that is the foundation of our emotional reactions, is exactly the same power as the wisdom and compassion of the Buddha nature too. And therefore it's really important, A, that we don't make an enemy of it, and that we don't try and separate ourselves from it, because that would be like separating ourselves from life, in which case life becomes very drab and very empty. And we also need to not be overwhelmed by it as well. And that's the divinity side of it, because of course divinity can be hostile. It doesn't have to be benign. But suffice to say that whether hostile or divine, the act that the human makes proper in front of divinity is, of course, that bowing into, because divinity is simply something that's greater than myself. When you strip back that theology, when you strip back all that philosophy, and you talk about the direct experience of spiritual power or the divine, it is that beholding. For example, when one is before the raw elemental power of nature, and we can imagine, we don't have to imagine, even nowadays, if we leave our cities and we go out into that vast landscape, or we are caught out in a thunderstorm with those clouds rolling over us, who doesn't feel a little bit frightened? Maybe we're frightened we're going to get struck by lightning or something, but even just standing there beholding those rolling and growling clouds, you can feel the elemental terror, and that is the experience of the presence of that divinity in nature. For example, this is the kami in the Shinto shrine, and so putting their hands together and bowing into that is that aspect of simply handing oneself over to that power, not being taken over by it. In fact, it saves us from being taken over by it, because it's only when we stem ourselves against those emotional energies, the emotional energies being the nature within, if you like, whereas thunderstorms and volcanoes is nature without. That bowing into it prevents us from being overwhelmed by it. But the the fact that it functions like that is because the body understands the functioning of that. I may not understand that. I may not understand it, or maybe I do understand it, but even understanding the psychology of it makes no difference. It's the actual doing, it's the actual giving myself into the doing of it that makes the difference. And this is the thing about ritual as well. Now, we can often sort of poo-poo it a little bit and think, oh well, I'm not really interested in these sort of external trappings. But that's only if we say that if we're only aware of head knowledge. If I think it's about my understanding and what I think is important, then we lose out on what the body senses is or knows to be important as well, and that ritual action is very much part of that. Same with our Zazen too. Zazen too is a ritual action. Make no mistake about it. But the important thing is that we give ourselves into it, because of course ritual action can be empty. If I hold myself back from that ritual action and, so to speak, judge it, then if I'm not really giving it, if I'm just going through the motions, it's not going to make much of an impact. In fact, it can easily become very dead. I really have to give myself wholeheartedly into it. And of course, whatever I give my heart to, then really does become alive. And this is the importance again of a regular practice with the chanting, with the sitting practice too. And if we adopt a simple timetable in order to give myself into it during the day, getting up, doing the things that we have to do. These are all ritual actions, and of course, in exactly the same way as it can transform a room into a zendo. If we structure our life in such a way that we adopt and that we're beginning to cultivate an attitude that the ordinary everyday occurrences of life, our chores, our work, etc., are grist to the mill, are part of daily life practice, then our daily life becomes sacralized. It becomes sacred. In that way, it all becomes part of the practice. And at the same time, it becomes less personal. And so those slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, when they do occur, those can be borne, because actually it's not about always being right or always being on top. It's about discovering and exploring our heart, and in the end coming into the ambience and presence of our own heart, because that divinity that we experience when we in that thunderstorm, or when we experience nature within, of course that is our heart, projected out or projected in or projected onto this or into that. It's all our own heart anyway, but of course we see it as separate from ourselves. We see it as objects and I as the subject. So ritual action at the end of it is about experiencing and participating with. And again, Venerable Myokyo-ni used to say, the head wants to understand things, but when it comes to it, the heart's not interested in understanding. What the heart really wants is to participate. And that participation is what's called a participation mystique, that real, what we call in Buddhism, samadhi, and that oneness with. And as the Mahayana Sutra says, that heart rolls with the 10,000 things, 10,000 things being the term for phenomena. And that rolling is truly mysterious, and it is mysterious, and this is why in the end what's happening in the heart of that true believer as he bows, that is indescribable. We can even describe the psychology or the neurology of the whole thing, but it's not the living experience of it. It's in that living experience, it is truly indescribable. Well, we'll leave that there for now.